Listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class.
What kinds of things do you think of when I mention the term paper that's due next week? No doubt you associate some amount of stress with the reminder about the term paper. Of course, you're all feeling different levels of stress regarding the term paper. Some of you may be feeling almost no stress at all, and some of you may be totally stressed out. Stress is a very personal thing. People react to different situations differently. Basically, stress occurs when an individual's perception of the demands placed upon them by their environment outweighs their perception of their own ability to meet those demands. It breaks down to how much you think you can handle compared to how much is expected of you. So, to go back to the term paper that's due next week, those of you who think you can write the paper over the weekend won't be as stressed about it as those of you who think you need 2 more weeks to complete the paper. It's all a matter of perception. So, let's take a minute to look at the body's reaction to stress. Now, back in the 1920s, a man named Hans Selye explained the process our bodies go through when we experience stress. He called the process the general adaptation syndrome. There are 3 stages in our response: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. First, we experience the alarm reaction. That's the first thing our bodies do when we encounter stress. Basically, the alarm reaction is all about getting physically prepared to respond to danger. You may have heard of the term fight or flight. Well, that's what the alarm response is basically getting our bodies ready to do. This alarm reaction is really helpful because it automatically prepares us for whatever might happen. But there are some drawbacks too. While our bodies are on such high alert, our immune systems are less effective. So that means that we're more vulnerable to getting sick when we're having an alarm reaction. It seems like a small drawback, maybe, but when our immune systems are taxed for long periods, it can be pretty harmful to our bodies. Okay, so if stress continues for a period of time, our reaction changes a little bit. We're no longer in the alarm reaction phase when our bodies get used to the stress they are facing. What happens is we enter the resistance stage. In this stage, we adapt to deal with the stressor. Maybe you'd like an example. Okay, picture this. Someone with anorexic behavior eats very little food. So in this case, the stressor that the body is facing is starvation, right? Okay, so during the resistance stage, the person might discover that he or she has little interest in physical activity. You see, this is the body's response to starvation. It is an attempt to spend as little energy as possible. The body has adapted to the stressor of starvation. Another response the body might perform as it adapts to the stressor of starvation is to increase its efficiency at getting all of the nutrients out of food. That would certainly be advantageous in a starvation situation, of course. The body would have to rely on a small amount of food for all its vital nutrients. As a result, it would extract as much benefit as possible from the food it received. Okay, now maybe you have heard of people who work really stressful jobs, and they end up having a heart attack really young. Well, that's related to the 3rd stage of our body's reactions to stress. You see, eventually, our bodies just become exhausted from dealing with the stressor. Stage 3 is exhaustion. Our immune system just gets really run down and tired, and it can't fight off the illnesses it once would have been able to protect us from. In the exhaustion stage, our bodies experience serious negative physical effects. An early heart attack would be an example of this. It could be brought on by a situation where someone works an extremely stressful job, which creates long-term stress for the body and leads to the exhaustion stage, where the person's body no longer functions properly.
Listen to part of a talk in a geology class.
So, last time we talked about how the Earth was formed. Today we're going to talk about Earth's atmosphere. Did you know that our current atmosphere is actually, in a sense, Earth's 3rd atmosphere?
Really? What were the first and second atmospheres like?
Well, the first atmosphere was full of hydrogen and helium. Now, over time, this atmosphere gradually dissipated, so the Earth had no atmosphere at all. There were no gases surrounding the planet, but there were still gases trapped inside the Earth, and they got emitted every now and again through volcanic activity. This process, where gases from the planet's interior are emitted, that's called outgassing. Wait a minute, did I say now and again? Actually, there was a lot of volcanic activity during this period of Earth's history, and that's how we got our second atmosphere. So stuff like carbon dioxide and water vapor were released from the planet, and these gases created the second atmosphere. Oh, and nitrogen. There was nitrogen in the second atmosphere.
That sounds a lot different from the composition of the atmosphere today. The third atmosphere. Now it's something like 80% nitrogen and 20% oxygen. You didn't even mention oxygen in the second atmosphere.
Good point. There was hardly any oxygen during that time. I should point out, by the way, that there's more than just nitrogen and oxygen in our atmosphere today. We've also got a little argon and a little carbon dioxide. But back to the point about oxygen. Knowing what you know about oxygen, where do you guess it would have come from?
Plants? The process of photosynthesis turns carbon dioxide into oxygen.
Very good. And over time, carbon dioxide levels decreased greatly, while oxygen levels increased greatly. How did that happen? Well, I'm not going to get into the chemistry of it, but oxygen was created in small amounts through the process of photolysis, and that's... Does anyone know? That's decomposition of molecules caused by light, actually. Interesting, huh? So, photolysis was the first stage of oxygen production in Earth's atmosphere. Ultraviolet light, and maybe lightning, we're not sure, and I'm putting this in very basic terms here, but ultraviolet light essentially split water vapor and carbon dioxide molecules into oxygen and hydrogen. Of course, the amount of oxygen created through photolysis, well, it was really a very small concentration, but it was a first step. Next, we had the appearance of ozone, which is made when ultraviolet radiation changes oxygen in the atmosphere. I think all of you know this, but I'll mention it anyway. Oxygen is O2 and ozone is O3. Got it? Once we had ozone, this made it possible for life to move out of the sea and onto the land, and that's when we started to see the first plants on land. Around maybe 400 million years ago. At this point, plant photosynthesis really started to generate a lot of oxygen. And that explains, as I was saying earlier, how it is that levels of carbon dioxide have decreased so much and oxygen levels have increased so much. So, if there aren't any questions, I'd like to move on to...
Listen to part of a lecture in an American history class.
Okay, so continuing our talk about early American development, today I'd like to touch on the topic of railroads. In the early years of the United States, the majority of the population lived on the East Coast. But as new land was acquired and American pioneers moved westward in larger numbers, the need eventually arose for better ways to transport people and goods from one end of this increasingly large country to the other. Private roads were being built, but cars, of course, hadn't yet been invented. And it was clear that horses and carriages weren't capable of meeting the transportation needs of all these people who were packing their possessions and moving west. But more important for the country and its economy was the need to provide adequate transportation for all the commerce that was taking place out in the frontier. In order to tap into the business potential created by this population of pioneers, you first had to, you had to find a way to get products and supplies out there. Some of the early attempts to meet these new transportation demands included iron railways designed for horse-drawn carriages to travel on, and man-made canals that connected rivers and lakes to allow steamships greater range. But the most efficient solution to the country's transportation problems combined the best assets of these earlier methods: the railroad tracks from the horse-drawn railways, and best of all, steam engines from the steamships. It was this new technology that would eventually make the railroads so popular, much more popular than steamships ever were. And so, the steam-powered engine, with a set of railroad tracks, became trains as we now know them. Around the 1830s, railroads overcame their competition because they were a fast, cheap, and direct form of mass transportation. Railroads rapidly gained popularity, and new sets of tracks were constructed at a tremendous rate. By 1840, there were almost 3,000 miles of tracks in the USA. By 1850, there were more than 9,000 miles of tracks. By 1860, 30,000 miles. However, despite the railroad's popularity, or perhaps because of it, there were problems. Without a central group to organize all these construction efforts, the end results were neither practical nor efficient. The first railroads were, well, nothing more than unconnected local systems, each running for only a few miles. Even worse, because there was no single person or group to regulate all this construction, the tracks weren't all built the same size. There were different tracks of different widths all across the country, and therefore they could not be easily linked. A train that ran on my tracks, for example, might not be able to roll onto yours. If the tracks were different sizes, if one set was wider than the other, it was nearly impossible. By 1860, there were 7 different widths of railroad tracks being used in the United States. There were 2 main factors that eventually led to the standardization of railroad track widths. The first was the growing need to ship grain and other food back east from farms in the recently settled West. All that open land out west was being used to grow food. Farmers were growing all kinds of crops that they needed to get to markets in the big cities on the East Coast. The second factor was war. In 1861, the American Civil War began when, as the southern states attempted to break away from the North. The rush to build new railroads slowed as the nation concentrated its resources on the war effort. But usage of existing tracks rose sharply. You know, the army had a need to transport vast numbers of troops and supplies from one place to another, and the railroad was a perfect solution. But in order for the railroad to be an effective tool of the military, standardization of track widths was required. The Railroad Act of 1862 was designed to add government backing to this idea that people had been talking about for a while. But no one could quite agree over how to do. Well, anyway, it was the idea of building a transcontinental railroad. That is, a set of tracks that spanned from one end of the continent to the other, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. It also set the standard width for railroad tracks. This paved the way for an interconnected network of railroad tracks across the country. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was officially completed when the symbolic golden spike was hammered into the tracks in Utah. The golden spike was the last spike, and yes, it was actually made of gold. And of course, it was driven in with great ceremony by a silver hammer. This marked an important moment in the development of the US, from a group of, states and territories into a single, unified country.